Okay, this will be part 2 of the developmental overview training, and I hope you've had time to watch the 3 videos that came from Harvard's Center on the Developing Child. I'm going to go ahead and give you an overview of the developmental areas that we mentioned before: the source of information, the cognition and emotional development. And you can see here we have another quote from Caroline Pratt from 1948, pretty much saying what we still understand and that science has borne out. So again, reminder, you have these little sound pieces. If you want to review the PowerPoint on your own, you can click on that and I'll be reading the quote so that you can have that if you like doing that. But the main point she's making is that if we introduce what she calls second-hand knowledge, which comes from, as she says, the teacher instead of the world, books instead of life, that we are really wasting this period of early childhood. It's so special and unique, and I'm hoping you'll see over the next several slides and our look at these really special times in life that you'll come to understand that too. You may already believe that, which is great. So this first period, of course, when you're born, many anthropologists will refer to this as the in-arms period. So this, at this point, is you saw the serve and return process, and you can understand how this serve and return really starts with skin-to-skin contact, the heartbeat, all the things you experienced in the womb now are you're experiencing out of the womb. So this serve and return and this connection with whomever your primary caregiver is really your matrix, your source for information, and your exploration of your environment as it broadens out certainly becomes part of that as well. You notice this picture here is from the documentary Babies, which is not the documentary series on Netflix, although I do believe you can also see this film on Netflix, but it is not the same series. This is from a documentary that's just one film called Babies, which I really recommend if you've never seen it. It's fantastic, and it really illustrates a lot of the things we're going to talk about. And one of the things that it really demonstrates is an issue regarding equity and opportunity that I just want to insert here as we're going through these developmental areas. That film, for me, more than any other film, really demonstrates how many misconceptions we have about equity and opportunity when it comes to early childhood development. And oftentimes we look at children who are in spaces like the country Namibia, and Opulo is the region in Namibia. We look at children in those spaces and say they're lacking so much, and how can they thrive, and so on. And yes, of course, they deserve clean water and those sorts of things if they don't have them. We can't make the assumption they don't. But so all spaces should be made equitable and safe and healthy, of course. But it would be a mistake to think that those children in those spaces are not as advantaged as our kids, because our kids are able to see things on TV and learn things on iPads and go to preschools where they learn their alphabet, that sort of thing. As it turns out, the research shows that children who are not indoctrinated early in those kinds of academic experiences, and who are not as inside, they're outside more than they're inside, exploring. And they have longer periods where they have these very relaxed interactions with their peers and their mothers or other caregivers in in their world, it turns out they do much better in terms of these developing intelligences in the area of emotional and social and cognition. And unless, of course, the inequity is related to nutrition or clean waters, things like that. But in terms of their experience, and if you watch this movie, Babies, you'll really see this. It contrasts these four babies in these four different worlds. And there's a book called Multiplication is for White People. Another one is The Pedagogy of Confidence. Still another one is Unbanking the Fire, and Possible Schools is another one. So those are all books where the research is documented about what's actually true. So I just wanted to put that out there for you to think about and understand. And again, I would encourage you to look at these other sources, especially the documentary Babies. Not all of us have time to read 4 books. I understand that. But it could be that you have an hour and a half or an hour, I think the film is, to watch. So I would recommend that. All right, so back to this time. Yes, anthropologists, Joseph Chilton Pearce writes about this. Other people write about this. They call it the in arms period. It's really simply just, why is the period called that? Because you're in somebody's arms, or you're on the floor, or you're in your crib, but you're not yet moving yourself around in space. You're moving, but you're not moving yourself around in space. Piaget called it the sensory motor period. Harvard calls it the servant return period. There's so much happening in terms of what the movement of a young child is doing as it activates the brain. So the more mobile a child is, the more the brain is activated. Now this is not to suggest that children should be moving. It's great to have periods of stillness and they need to rest. So yes, of course. But a really good illustration of this is in a book called The Hand, How It Shapes the Brain, Language, and Culture. And it was written by Dr. Frank Wilson, who is a hand surgeon. And each chapter goes over different ways people use their hands in life. A carpenter, a surgeon, a musician, a painter, a gardener, all the different ways people use their hands, and what parts of the brain are actually activated by that use of the hand, which is, I find, fascinating. But more important, it really shows us how one aspect of our movement contributes to brain activity and how important that is. So when you think about children's hands and what parts of the brain are being activated, that's pretty amazing. And just a reminder that many times we think of infants as not mobile because they're not moving in space. But as any mother who's expecting can tell you, they're mobile. And just try changing their diapers or giving them a bath before they're crawling or pulling up even, and it's quite an ordeal. So we know they're moving, and we know their preoccupation with their own movements in the beginning is part of their development of how they're informed. So just kind of bear in mind that as children are developing through infancy and toddlerhood, this movement is really what's activating the brain. We can tell them and show them and do everything you can imagine to try to, quote, educate them or activate their little brains. But we know that it's really movement that does that. And movement involves experiences. And those experiences involve their senses. So all of that works together to build the intellectual or the cognitive development. And something that happens during this period is what many of you may know as object permanence. You may have understood that before. Peekaboo is the simplest way to think about object permanence, and that's at some point in the cognition of a child that it shifts into and away from not understanding that things still exist when I can't see them. So this leads into that period of separation anxiety. All of that happens because as I develop cognitively, I start to understand that when I can't see things, they still exist. So I go looking for them. And that's a really big piece of development for obvious reasons, but also what many people don't know is that these are the seeds of memory developing. And memory, as we all know, is an incredibly important skill and capacity. And so this period is, again, these are these really important periods of time in a young child's life that really can't be duplicated. I mean, when people have traumatic brain injury, you do things, to remediate the brain, of course. And yes, it's great if people can recover. But this time in early childhood is so unique and so important. To skip past it is really a problem. So when you're talking about peekaboo, you can help your new teachers and parents understand that you're planting the seeds that will develop into this capacity to remember things and to hold an image in the brain, which also becomes important later on. So again, here's a little funny video. You can watch this if you want to. It's pretty funny, although I would not say anybody should actually do it with their young child. But it is pretty great at illustrating this concept of object permanence, if it's not already clear to you. And of course, at this time in life, your emotional well-being, your development emotionally is all about trust. And of course, that's part of the serve and return. But I also want to just emphasize that it's not just trust and responsiveness. Of course, that matters. That's everything. But there's also this other element of trust that's developing through toddlerhood, essentially emotionally, that the world is a good and joyful place. So if you're a toddler and you're around somebody who doesn't see the world that way, isn't excited about things, and doesn't have wonder and awe at the beauty and interesting things around them, children can really experience that through you. So to be cynical and not happy about life and the goodness of life and then the goodness of the world is not something we want young children to experience from us. So it's really important that they can trust that the world is good and joyful. Even as adults, if we know, of course we know that everything's not always wonderful. However, we can have an optimistic and cheerful outlook and kind of that, always keep to the sunny side of life. Not in a naive way, but in a genuine way. To really believe in our hearts and the basic goodness of things. That's really important when you're around young children, to convey that, because their emotional well-being depends on it. So it doesn't just depend on you being responsive, it depends on you believing that things are good and being excited and happy about life. So here is the wisdom of the toddler. And I love these two particular quotes because they come from the same person, Rachel Corrie, who unfortunately passed away in her early 20s. But her parents kept all of her writing and recordings of her talking, which are pretty incredible. And I love this first quote from her that they saved when she was 2, and then this longer quote that came from her when she was 16, which almost is saying the same thing. But at 16, of course, she's got the language that she did not have as a 2-year-old. But you can see she's got this feeling as a 2-year-old. So I love that. And again, you have the sound piece here if you want to go back in and you can hear me read it, or you can read it to yourself. It's really beautiful. Some things to ask ourselves about toddlers to 2-year-olds, is to think about how they became upright. Did they crawl for long periods of time? Did they spend a lot of time on the floor exploring? Did they have a lot of experiences going up and down things? All of that. Did they spend time outdoors? And what were their sensory experiences like? So all of that informs us, because if they did not have a lot of this, you might want to try to find ways to provide them with those opportunities. So yes, of course, a toddler or 2-year-old can walk, but could you give them something where they crawled through an obstacle course, something like that? So just make sure that they're continuing to have those experiences. Also really important for their development. Again, motion activates the brain, so that's why these things matter. Crawling, walking, all of these experiences of right-left movement, they develop both sides of the brain and activate both sides and get them working together, so very important for cognitive development. Your source of information as you get a little older continues to be your caregivers, of course, but now that you're able to motor-wise explore more, because you can walk and move around more, and sometimes you can run, your own initiatives to experience things become a source of information. So your sensory motor activity becomes increasingly important about how you understand the world. And so you have this dilemma that happens at this age that I want to talk about for a minute. A lot of times people will say, that child looked right at me and then did something they weren't supposed to, touch something that I told them not to touch or whatever. But people often say they looked right at me, so you can't tell me they didn't know. Well, unfortunately, cognitively, Piaget and other people who study young children help us know that when you're this age, you really don't think ahead about what you're doing. And if you watch a toddler or 2-year-old long enough, that should be clear. But it's kind of funny, but it's true. And so the idea that a child reaches up for something and then looks at you as if to defy you, so to speak, is not actually cognitively, science-wise, possible. The science says no. This is an example of that I talked about earlier, where the science really helps us understand that the things we used to believe kids were doing and why they were doing them, they're just not accurate. So what's really happening there? So you, as a young child, again, your source of information about the world is your caregiver, right? The person who you depend on for your life, literally, and your sensory motor activity. Both of those things at the same time. So what happens when they're in conflict with each other? What happens when you have a need to touch something to understand it, but you also have a need to be connected to this caregiver? Well, you have this major dilemma as you're practicing on the world. So the best thing we can do to relieve a child about that is, to go over and say, oh, you want to see what this is? Let me pull it down and let's look at it together. And then you can provide a safe experience for the child. If you don't have time to do that, which you may not, the main thing you want to do is resolve it for the child in a way that doesn't cause them to feel conflicted between you and the object. So that could just mean looking around your environment and removing things like that. But just know that the science does not bear out that this is a deliberate intention on the part of the really young child. So toddlers, they're developing filters. Again, they're sensory beings still, but they are not. If we get down here, place the sponge in the bowl, put the food color in, and everything mixes up, and the young child can't say, stop pouring so much blue, right? But a toddler kind of starts to be able to do that. They start to be able to say, I don't think I want that macaroni and cheese. No, thank you. So they start to be able to filter out what they want and don't want. But it's all based on senses. It's not anything they really think much about. So their cognition is, again, this object permanence is still, these seeds of memory are still processing. They're now starting to have separation issues that come and go. They do absorb, and what happens in the brain is a process in the nerves called myelination. So myelination is basically strengthening neural connections. The more you do something, the stronger the connection should be. If you're doing something instead of being told about something, myelination occurs more rapidly. If you're just telling me something and I'm not doing anything, myelination, it might never happen, actually, especially with young children, but it's less likely to happen, and you'll have to say, how many times do I have to tell you? 5 million? Yes. The answer is yes. Yes. For myelination to occur, you have to tell me something many more times than if we actually do the thing you want me to do, and I practice doing it. So this is why kids open and close a drawer 500 times, right? They're practicing that skill, but also myelination is occurring. So what is myelination in the end? It's the process of these connections becoming so solidified in the brain that they become automatic. So the best way for adults to understand this, really simple. If you drive a car, when you first learned to drive, you had to really think about it, right? You read about it in the driver's manual, all of that stuff, and then you tried to do it, and then you tried to make a turn or know when to put the brakes on, all of that stuff. Well, now you're driving, 10 years later, everything's myelinated. You're probably daydreaming while you're driving. Not good, right? But the process is more automated than it was in the beginning, and that's the simplest way to understand it. Would you have ever learned to drive if you never drove? Think about that. So you move and your brain is activated. That's for your whole life, but really important in young children. So what kinds of experiences do they need? You can see you let the child serve and respond. You have minimal explanations for things. You remove obstacles when they're appropriate to development or to what the child is trying to do. And most important, remember from that Center for Developing Child in Harvard that the brain is expecting to have these experiences. It's waiting for them. So just keep that in mind. What does it mean about toddlers and behavior? We've kind of talked about that, so you can think about that. Again, we've turned upside down this idea of how to discipline or manage behavior. So really important to think about that. I love a book called The Art of Possibility, and toddlers and preschoolers, they really live in this possible space. They're what Piaget calls pre-operationals, right? So they don't have structures in the brain that as adults we can really fully understand because ours are developed, and we don't think that way anymore, although we can probably relate to some degree to doing something and then thinking about it. So imagine that's your whole day or your whole life, and maybe you can relate a little bit. But it's really important to understand that young children are pre-operational in their thought. This means they do something and then they do something again, and then they do it and do it and do it. And then at some point, they do something and they notice what happens. And at another point, they start to learn about what happens. They do it and they see what happens. They do it and they see what happens. And then still later on, they start to do things and anticipate what will happen. They kind of think they know what will happen. And that comes much later. way past age 3. Some kids will show evidence of that earlier, of course, but this whole process, it's a long story. So you want to just be aware that these possibilities are where young children really live. And a nice way to think about this from that book is that you have a small box. It holds all of your spark, your possibility, your dreams. So if you're a toddler, up until the age of 3, 4, 5 even, that box is full. It's full of everything everywhere. And if you're asked at a young age to remember things, that you've experienced and supposedly learned from, that's very stressful. So just keep that in mind. So here you are, a toddler. Your cognition is that anything's possible. Your source is your own movement and your interaction, and still your caregiver, right? So what can your caregiver do to support that? They can offer you really simple either or choices because you're full of possibility. So if I say, what do you want for dinner? Whoa, that box is full. Anything's possible. Okay, how about grass? You see, toddlers say things like that, yes? Because everything's possible. So what you want to do is limit their choices. I know that seems counterintuitive, but if you imagine you live in this unlimited space, anything's possible. So when you offer choices, anything's possible. And that's overwhelming. So just keep your choice offering to a minimum. That's a little easier for me. You can say, do you want to go to the swing set or the slide? Because the swing set is full of possibilities for me as a toddler. There's a million things I could do with a swing. So don't ask me what I want to do on the swing. Just ask me, do I want to swing or slide? Because the slide also has a million possibilities. So you have to kind of understand that, and then understand that limiting those choices actually helps with the possibilities. I hope that makes kind of a little bit of sense. It does seem counterintuitive, I'm sure. So when you have these dilemmas, as I talked about before, hopefully now you can understand that this makes a lot of sense, and it's why young children who don't have the ability to manage all those possibilities have a lot, they can melt down. The more times during the day they have to draw on those unlimited possibilities in terms of their own choice making, that can become overwhelming. So less is more. Here you have this yes pathway, right? You have these pathways of yes, 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 yes. And you should create yes opportunities, right? You should let children say yes to the world around them, but just be mindful that you can also go too far the other way. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about this, resolving this serve and return process so you can trust it. So what happens when you get too many no's? When you're with somebody who doesn't see your possibilities? Well, even as adults, we understand this, right? Your day just spirals downward. And you might withdraw, or you may have the fight response where you're like, I will touch everything because I need to touch everything. Yeah, so just remember, children spiral down just like we do when people don't see their possibilities. Here's a nice chart for seeing possibilities. You can notice that at these young ages, your brain's ability to change in response to experience, look how high it is up there, and as you get older, it declines, right? And here's the amount of effort that you have to put out to make those changes in the brain. Notice how low it is here and how high it goes. So I think that's a really great chart. You could use that with, again, parents or new teachers to also show this capacity in the brain. So you can, in the part 3 of the training, you'll be looking at application and how to explain all this and set this all up. So just a quick question. How do you set up a yes environment? Um, how do you look around your classroom and show somebody, this is why I have my classroom set up this way, because of this need for supporting children in their possibilities. The question in the heart of a toddler is always about independence, and can I trust that I will grow more independent? And you'll notice here that socially I really don't regard my peers as friends. I hear you call them friends a lot, but I don't yet have an understanding of the concept of friendship. I'm learning about it, right? So you can show me about it, do puppets, stories, all that kind of thing, songs. I'm not really sorry if I do things, if I act on, the world by pushing a friend down or falling on top of a friend or taking a block and hitting a friend with it. It's just not the same thing as it is for an adult or an older child to do that. So the main thing I can do is to just be part of the solution around that. And if I'm consistently doing things that are creating those kinds of sensory judgment boundary issues for me, you need to ask for help so you can help me. Moving me away and isolating me in a timeout, for example, is not helpful. You could remove me and rock me, or you could, just say, I can see you're having a hard time. Let's go over here and, I'll help you, kind of thing. So this time in is what's necessary. And I'm not going to go too deeply into that, but at the heart of a toddler's social emotional development is this need for acting on the world and being independent, and that can sometimes cause conflict. Because I now realize all these things are separate from me, and I can do a lot, and this me do it, these moments of I'll do it myself, come more and more often. And I may want to go back to that in arms period. So Erickson calls this time autonomy versus shame for a really good reason, right? I'm learning to toilet train. I'm learning to do all these things independently. And if I meet with a lot of shaming or a lot of criticism or judgment about that, I will experience myself as ashamed. And that's not what we're hoping for. So here we go into the 3 to 5 year old realm. You notice the repeat word here, explosion. So this is a really interesting time because kids have all this stuff going on. And it's a really powerful time and a just incredible growth. And they also can experience emotionally this feeling of wanting to go back. Where's my blankie is what I often say about it, because so much is happening. And my grandson had this great conversation with me recently. He's 4, and he was talking to me about when he remembered that he loved being a baby. So I'm not a baby, but I loved being a baby. Remember that when I loved being a baby? So I thought, well, that's great to kind of illustrate this point of, I know I'm not a baby, but I really loved being a baby. And that's really characteristic of this age. So what are my sources for information? Have you noticed it's the animal world? So all of a sudden I'm a duck, I'm a puppy, I'm a doggy, I'm a kitty, I'm a birdie, all these things. And I have a real connection a lot of times to animals, to thinking about animals and wanting to pretend to be an animal and all of that. Really a big part of, my connection to information. And I often relate my own activity to that animal kingdom. It's very interesting. So your cognition is changing, and you can now use information to act upon your surroundings in ways that are not, quote, real, because you can imagine things. So you're living in this kind of dream world, and you can imagine anything. and you have the language and the motor ability to act on it. So it's pretty powerful. There's something called executive function that comes into play in your cognition that we're going to go more deeply into. But the important thing to remember is that it's the seeds of executive function in the brain, and you will go through development of this part of your brain until your late 20s. So I always say get comfortable with being uncomfortable, because it's only the beginning of this. I'm going to let you watch this video on your own about executive function and self-regulation, so that you can take your time through it. It's a short video. It goes by really fast. So here's some notes from it. Executive function really is the part of your brain that helps you learn to work with others, work with demands in life. It allows you to learn for your lifetime. It allows you to take what you learn and apply it. And I love Harvard's thing that they mention in the video, that it's really your brain's air traffic controller. It manages everything coming in, and therefore everything going out. So just a few notes on that before you watch the video. And also in terms of managing information, it allows you to work with distractions, turn-taking, self-management, memory of expectations. So if you're turn-taking and it's your turn, all of a sudden it's your turn. Do you remember what you're supposed to do on your turn? That kind of thing. And that's all about working memory and your ability to be flexible in your thinking. All of that is in that video. So what I've done here is kind of giving you a preview of things to watch out for as you're viewing. And again, we come into what are the cognitive, processes and their implications for how we see young children. Here's another spot where science has helped us understand that things like you're not listening and you need to control yourself, those are not possible right now. They're learning to do that. And kids have varying abilities. Some kids are really able to manage themselves, and other kids seem to have no ability to do that. And so we want to really work on those skills intentionally. And there are a lot of suggestions on that website about the kinds of activities that support it. And again, in future trainings, we'll be looking at those activities also. But I just want to point out that here's another space where science has turned this upside down and said, stop saying that, because cognitively it's just not happening yet. And it creates this downward spiral. So we want to keep that in mind. We're talking about the prefrontal cortex in the region in the brain, but also about the myelination of those networks with other parts of the brain interacting with that part of the brain. So you're building more and more neural networks and capacities that become myelinated with use and practice. So that, if you practice for a long enough time, you know how to take a turn by age 4 because you've been through that practice. And that is part of what executive function allows you to do. So again, what should we be doing? Just again, from that same space of looking at executive function, we're looking at impulse control, we're looking at social and emotional turn-taking, managing input by minimizing it. Again, if you go back to the toddler slide portion of this training, you remember I said it seems counterintuitive that if I can imagine a million possibilities, why shouldn't you let me choose from those? Well, because it's too much. And, yes, I have all these possibilities, but I really don't need to be pushed into looking at every single one of them, because cognitively I can't. So again, you're managing that input for, the 3, 4, and 5-year-old child. If you think about the air traffic controller, part of executive function, you want to minimize the input. Not so much that it's boring, you don't want to have a kid and, not having any input either. But I think our kids are more in danger of having too much input, so that by minimizing it, we actually allow them to make use of what's coming in. Otherwise, it's just not there. It's not able to be used because it's too much. And again, the same thing with flexibility. It's not possible if I'm not allowed to actively use my imagination. So you want to let kids practice these skills and use them as much as possible, but not by creating more input. You want to minimize the input, maybe have 5 puppets instead of 20, if that makes sense. So simple things like that can really make a difference. This is the age where I become the teller of the tall tale. If you work with four-year-olds and some 3-year-olds, you really already know this. But it matters in terms of my cognitive development. I have the language, I have the imagination, I have some experiences now. I'm developing flexible thinking. What I'm not doing is lying. This again has a lot to do with intention. Remember, I'm still pretty pre-operational in my thinking, so I'm not sitting down and saying, I broke that lamp, now I'm going to lie about it. I'm sitting down and saying, I broke that lamp, and now the primary caregiver, who's my deep down connection, is unhappy with me. So what do I do? Right? So it's the same dilemma. And now I have the ability to really tell a story about it. So I'm cross-referencing everything I have. Everything. Books, stories, songs, shows, trips, conversation, all of it. But I'm not lying. I'm just not capable of that yet, but I am really good at telling a great story, especially if it means that you, my primary caregiver, will be happy with me. So that's a really kind of a tightrope we walk. And again, we won't get into a lot of specifics here, but just know that this is a really important time in life. You're developing internal images. Things that interfere with that would be to restrict your imagination and expression, and also too much screen time provides the images for the brain. And once the brain locks in the image, it cannot believe that an apple isn't red, for example. So those are really important pieces to think about. Why do I need to develop these things? I have to problem solve. I have to understand symbols like alphabets, letters and numbers. If I want to read later on with comprehension, I have to be able to imagine what a word is. And I really can't advance in terms of academic processes beyond just memorizing stuff and not really understanding it if I don't have this period of imagination. So here's some guides on how to nurture this time. And there's a lot there from early age on. So I'll, definitely would think you'd, really appreciate those. I know I do. So what's my heart doing right now? Well, during ages 3 to 5, I'm learning to trust my own intuition. I have a lot of thoughts and imagination, again. Sometimes those thoughts make me feel afraid, and I'll start to have nightmares, and I want to come running back to safe places. And I'm asking the question, can I trust my judgment about things? Do I feel good about being successful? Can I try things and trust my intuition? Can I imagine and solve problems and try out solutions? Or do I always feel guilty or bad about my initiatives? So this intuition, this ability to trust yourself and to trust what you imagine you could do becomes increasingly important over this 3 to 5-year-old period. You have what's called an emotional relational brain. You're living in sort of a dream world. So with all this possibility, you can become really overwhelmed emotionally and have really strong, big feelings. Virginia Chance who I worked with at the Chance School long time ago, she told me one time when I was teaching this age that she used to call this the martini age. And she said it was for two reasons. One, because children seemed to behave like they'd had a few drinks, or that you as an adult needed a martini after being around them for a long time. So I always thought that was a great way to think about this age and to have a sense of humor about it. And last is this idea of self-talk. If you watch children this age, they're talking the whole time they're playing, and it's self-talk. And they're using this source of story now to talk to themselves about what they're doing out loud. And it's the way they process a lot of information. So it's really important to allow for it and to allow them to create these images internally. And I'm hoping that you enjoy it, because unfortunately, this little brief moment in time where they don't know what's real and what's not goes away and does not come back. The ability to imagine things stays, but to imagine them and think they're real, it just doesn't last very long. So I hope we can enjoy it and have a great sense of humor about it. And of course, emotionally, I need to have experiences that build my success and don't make me feel guilty about making messes or falling down. And I need to grow my confidence again about acting in real ways on the world. So I need to really garden. I need to really cook. I need to really be allowed to clean and help and sit and cut things and ride a bike and be a doctor and take care of you. All of these things become really important because they grow this confidence I have about my ability to imagine and make choices in real ways that allow me to imagine possibilities, just like I did when I was much younger. So, in conclusion, after looking over this incredible period of time, again, if we go back to birth, we know now the brain is shaped to expect experiences so that we can know ourselves. And it's so important that we keep coming back to that the brain expects to have these experiences. And it's the way it comes to know everything. So I love this quote from this particular author who I also love, and he writes a lot about his young children, and he talks about the answers that we're looking for as adults. You know, we look into many advanced spaces. We read books and we watch movies and we listen to the news, and we're looking for answers. And he really believes that it's in experiences with young children and what they're doing that we can find the real wisdom that we need. So I thought I would just remind us of that before we close. And then I have a really wonderful poet here named K.R.I. Majesty, and she has a wonderful poem about all of this that if you click on this link you can listen to. And the poem's called Send Us to the Forests, and I think it captures a lot of everything we looked at here about development. So I'd encourage you to listen to it, and you may even want to use some of the parts of it for your creation in your next stage of this training. So now you've completed the developmental overview in 2 recordings, and you can go on to the last portion you'll complete for TRIS credit. And that's the application where you'll create something to share with parents and new teachers about your own classroom and the age of development and experiences that you're providing and why you're providing them based on this information.